and welcome to Stories and Stuff. I've got another classic book from the 1970s for you here. It's called The Lighthouse Keeper's Lunch, and it has the best picnic you can ever imagine in it. Once there was a lighthouse keeper called Mr. Grinling. At night time he lived in a small white cottage perched high on the cliffs. In the daytime he rode out to his lighthouse on the rocks to clean and polish the light. Mr. Grinling was a most industrious lighthouse keeper. Come rain or shine, he tended his light. Sometimes at night, as Mr. Grinling lay sleeping in his warm bed, the ships would toot to tell him that his light was shining brightly and clearly out to sea. Each morning, while Mr. Grinling polished the light, Mrs. Grinling worked in the kitchen of the little white cottage on the cliffs, concocting a delicious lunch for him. Once she had prepared the lunch, she packed it into a special basket and clipped it onto the wire that ran from the little white cottage to the lighthouse on the rocks. But one morning something terrible happened. Mrs. Grinling had prepared a particularly appetising lunch. She had made a mixed seafood salad, a lighthouse sandwich, cold chicken garni, sausages and crisps, peach surprise, iced sea biscuits, drinks and assorted fruits. She put the lunch in the basket as usual and sent it down the wire. But the lunch did not arrive. It was spotted by 3 scavenging seagulls who set upon it and devoured it with great gusto. "Clear off, you varmints!" shouted Mr. Grinling, but the seagulls took not the slightest notice. "This is an excellent peach surprise, boys. She's a great cook, Fred. Scrumptious lunch, Tom." That evening, Mr. and Mrs. Grinling decided on a plan to baffle the seagulls. "Tomorrow I shall tie a napkin to the basket," said Mrs. Grinling. "Of course, my dear," agreed Mr. Grinling. "A sound plan." "They'll have to try harder than this to stop us, Bert." On Tuesday evening, Mr. and Mrs. Grinling racked their brains for another plan. "They are a brazen lot, those seagulls," said Mrs. Grinling. "Brazen indeed," said Mr. Grinling. "What shall we do?" "Our cat does not appear to like seagulls," said Mrs. Grinling. "No, my dear," said Mr. Grinling. "Hamish is an accomplished seagull chaser." "Of course," exclaimed Mrs. Grinling. "Tomorrow Hamish can guard the lunch." A most ingenious plan. Hamish did not think the plan was ingenious at all. He spat and hissed as Mrs. Grinling secured him in the basket. There, Hamish," said Mrs. Grinling consolingly. "I'll have a tasty piece of herring waiting for you when you arrive home." Sadly, flying did not agree with Hamish. His fur stood on end when the basket swayed, his whiskers drooped when he peered down at the wet blue sea, and he felt much too sick even to notice the seagulls, let alone chase them away from the lunch. "Pretty pussy, like a piece of lobster mornay. This food gets better every day, Fred. Aren't you going to chase us, pussy?" "Lack-a-day," said Mr. Grinling sadly. "Meow, meow," agreed Hamish pitifully. On Wednesday evening, Mr. and Mrs. Grinling racked their brains again for a new plan. "What shall we do?" said Mr. Grinling. Mrs. Grinling looked thoughtful. "I have it," she exclaimed. "Just the mixture for hungry seagulls." "Indeed, my dear," said Mr. Grinling. "What have you in mind?" "Wait and see," said Mrs. Grinling. "Just wait and see." "Mustard sandwiches," chuckled Mr. Grinling. "A truly superb plan, my dear, truly superb." On Thursday morning, Mrs. Grinling packed the mustard sandwiches and sent them off down the wire to the expectant seagulls. "Yuck! Ugh! Ah!" On Friday, Mrs. Grinling repeated the mustard mixture. "It's the same as yesterday's lunch, Fred. All right, boys, let's go and have lunch elsewhere." So on Saturday, up in the little white cottage on the cliffs, a jubilant Mrs. Grinling put away the mustard pot before she prepared a scrumptious lunch for Mr. Grinling. While he waited for his lunch down in the lighthouse on the rocks, Mr. Grinling sang snatches of old sea shanties as he surveyed the coastline through his telescope. And this is what he saw. "No mustard in this lot, Tom. We'll fly back here for lunch again tomorrow, boys. This is a delicious chocolate eclair, Fred." "Ah, well, such is life," mused Mr. Grinling as he sat down to enjoy a leisurely lunch in the warm sunshine. If I could pick anything from the picnic, it would have to be a lighthouse sandwich. What about you? What would you choose?